What if the first shots of the American Civil War weren't fired at Fort Sumter in 1861, but years earlier on the windswept prairies of Kansas? What if a single territory became a brutal testing ground where neighbor slaughtered neighbor, where elections were stolen at gunpoint, and where America's soul was ripped open over one question: should slavery spread into the West? This is the story of Bleeding Kansas, the savage, forgotten civil war that exploded in the 1850s and served as the bloody prelude to the national catastrophe that followed. A conflict driven by raw power, political manipulation, and clashing visions of America's future. By the end of this story, you'll understand how one state's violent birth shaped the destiny of the entire nation, why its scars still run deep, and why the battles fought on these plains still echo in today's divided politics. The war before the war is about to begin. For centuries, the vast grasslands of what would become Kansas belonged to native peoples, the Kansa, Osage, Pawnee, and others. They hunted enormous buffalo herds across an ocean of grass that seemed to stretch forever under an endless sky. Spanish explorers passed through in the 1500s seeking gold that was never there. French traders came later. Then, in 1803, the Louisiana Purchase brought this land under American control. For decades, it remained Indian country, promised to tribes removed from the east. Wagon trains rolled along the Santa Fe and Oregon trails, but few stayed. That all changed in 1854. Senator Stephen Douglas of Illinois pushed through the Kansas-Nebraska Act. He wanted a transcontinental railroad. To get Southern support, he introduced popular sovereignty, letting the settlers themselves vote on whether slavery would be allowed. It repealed the old Missouri Compromise line that had kept slavery out of the northern territories. Almost overnight, the prairie became a battlefield of ideas and bodies. Pro-slavery forces from Missouri and the South poured across the border. Anti-slavery settlers, free staters, and abolitionists rushed in from New England and the Midwest, funded by groups like the New England Emigrant Aid Company. Two competing governments emerged, one pro-slavery in Lecompton, one free state in Topeka and Lawrence. Fraudulent elections, intimidation, and violence became routine. The stage was set for something darker than anyone imagined. The first territorial legislature election was a farce. Thousands of armed border ruffians from Missouri crossed into Kansas, voted illegally, and installed a pro-slavery government. Free staters cried foul and formed their own shadow government. Tensions boiled. In November, a pro-slavery man murdered a free state settler. Thousands of armed men gathered along the Wakarusa River near Lawrence. Only frantic negotiation by the governor prevented an all-out battle. But peace was an illusion. May 21, 1856, the sack of Lawrence. A pro-slavery posse, carrying a U.S. flag and artillery, marched into the Free State stronghold. They burned the Free State Hotel, destroyed 2 newspaper offices, and looted homes. No one died that day, but the message was clear: slavery's supporters would use any means necessary. The very next day, news reached a fiery abolitionist named John Brown, living near Pottawatomie with his sons. Enraged by the attack on Lawrence and the brutal caning of Senator Charles Sumner in Washington, Brown decided God demanded vengeance. On the night of May 24, Brown and a small group dragged 5 pro-slavery settlers from their cabins along Pottawatomie Creek and hacked them to death with broadswords. The massacre shocked the nation. Retaliation followed. Farms burned. Men were murdered in cold blood. Newspapers back east screamed headlines, "Bleeding Kansas." The territory had earned its name. The violence escalated into a low-grade guerrilla war. Pro-slavery raiders burned free state settlements. John Brown's men struck back. In one battle near Pottawatomie, Brown's small force was nearly wiped out, but he escaped and became a national legend. Old Pottawatomie Brown. Hundreds died. Thousands more lived in fear. Families fled. The federal government seemed powerless or unwilling to stop the chaos. Politically, Bleeding Kansas tore the nation apart. The violence helped birth the Republican Party, united against the expansion of slavery. In Washington, debates turned violent. The Lecompton Constitution, a pro-slavery document pushed through with more fraud, divided even the Democratic Party. President James Buchanan supported it. Stephen Douglas opposed it, splitting Northern and Southern Democrats. By 1859, Free Staters finally gained control of the territorial legislature. They drafted the Wyandotte Constitution, banning slavery. On January 29, 1861, with Southern senators already walking out towards secession, Kansas entered the Union as a free state. The victory came at a terrible cost. The territory had previewed what America would soon endure on a massive scale. Many who fought in Kansas would later fight at Gettysburg and Shiloh. John Brown himself had already moved east to Harper's Ferry in 1859, trying to spark the slave rebellion he believed was inevitable. His raid failed, but his martyrdom further polarized the country. After statehood, Kansas threw itself into the Civil War with fierce loyalty to the Union. More than two-thirds of military-age men enlisted, highest per capita casualty rate of any state. Kansas regiments fought hard in the West. The state also became a refuge for escaped slaves and a base for Union operations against Confederate sympathizers in Missouri. Post-war, the real transformation began. Railroads pushed west. Cattle drives from Texas ended in booming cowtowns like Abilene, Dodge City, and Wichita, places where legends like Wyatt Earp and Wild Bill Hickok kept order amid chaos. Homesteaders poured in under the 1862 Homestead Act. Tough, determined families broke the tough sod. Then came the Mennonites from Russia, bringing turkey red wheat that thrived on the plains and turned Kansas into the wheat state. Economically, Kansas became the heart of America's agricultural powerhouse. Buffalo hunters cleared the plains. Farmers planted millions of acres. The state's position on major trails and rails made it a crossroads of commerce, but prosperity had its price. Native tribes were pushed onto smaller reservations, their way of life shattered. Economic booms and busts followed, boom and bust cycles of wheat prices, the Dust Bowl of the 1930s that drove families off the land. Yet Kansas endured, forging a resilient, independent character. Today, Kansas remains defined by the same vast skies and fertile, sometimes unforgiving soil. It leads the nation in wheat production, feeding millions at home and abroad. Wichita became an aerospace giant, producing aircraft that helped win World War II and beyond. The state balances agriculture, manufacturing, energy, and military installations. Politically, the spirit of independence born in bleeding Kansas lives on. Kansas has produced influential leaders and fiercely debated issues from taxation to education to social policy. Its history reminds Americans how quickly democracy can descend into violence when fundamental values clash. The state's story is taught as a cautionary tale, how compromise failed and extremism triumphed, setting the nation on a path to war. Yet Kansas also embodies renewal. From the ashes of territorial violence rose a state committed to freedom, however imperfectly realized. Its people carry forward a legacy of determination, whether battling prairie fires, economic hardship, or political division. Bleeding Kansas was more than a regional feud. It was America confronting itself in the mirror, raw, violent, and uncompromising. The battles over popular sovereignty revealed that the slavery question could not be voted away. It would be settled in blood. Kansas paid the price first so the nation could learn the terrible lesson. In our own time of deepening divides, the story of bleeding Kansas asks uncomfortable questions. How far will we go when principles collide? Can democracy survive when compromise feels like surrender? The prairies of Kansas still whisper the answer. Liberty is never free, and vigilance is the eternal price. The next time you see golden waves of wheat bending in the wind or drive through a quiet Kansas town, remember the blood that soaked this soil before the Civil War even began. This is where America's greatest test was rehearsed. This is bleeding Kansas, the war before the war that still shapes who we are. The plains endure. The question remains, will we?